Welcome to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to OHBM Neurosalience. And today we are talking about the future of scientific publishing. And as we all know, scientific publishing is in a bit of a flux. In this podcast, I talk with Nikolaus Kriegeskorte. Nico is a professor of psychology and neuroscience and director of cognitive imaging. He's the principal investigator at Columbia's Zuckerman Institute. I also talk with Michael Breakspear. And Michael Breakspear is a group leader of the Systems Neuroscience Group at the University of Newcastle, Australia. He's also a former editor-in-chief of Neuroimage. And Aina Puce is the third discussant. She is the Eleanor Cox Riggs Professor of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Indiana University in Bloomington. And she's also a former senior editor of Neuroimage. And I'm also a former editor-in-chief of Neuroimage, that when I was editor-in-chief, it was just before Michael, and things were pretty stable back then. It was still pure paywall sort of model, and things changed very quickly, even during Michael's time. And then obviously with Steve Smith, who was the editor-in-chief of Neuroimage when the entire editorial team decided to migrate to a nonprofit platform. And currently, there's a lawsuit that's going on, initiated by Lucina Uden. And this lawsuit has many facets to it. And without going into too much detail, it involves somewhat of a implication of an sort of a collective agreement between a lot of the big publishers to not pay reviewers, to not allow people to submit other manuscripts, submit their manuscripts to other journals at the same time, and also once they publish the paper to not be able to distribute it elsewhere. Of course, they also allow, though, preprint servers, which is another issue that I think will be a catalyst for change. Nico actually had expressed a lot of views in the past about peer review and open peer review, and the importance of having open, non-anonymous peer review. So with all that, we discuss many topics. We discuss everything from the various publishing models, the paywalls versus open access versus charging high APCs versus low APCs, other possible models like having everything just put into a preprint server and having the community collectively review these papers. We talk about peer review a lot and the idea, the culture of peer review, and why potentially having non-anonymous peer review is important, and how maybe it's been a neglected skill that should be taught more. We also briefly talk about publication types. Right now it's PDFs, but it's growing quickly into notebooks, code, data, and so on. So we talk about so much more, the long-term future of publishing, and a lot of the other aspects of the culture. We give a little bit of a history of the neuroimage exodus, and it was a great discussion, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So let me just start out quickly with the context of this podcast on the future of scientific publishing. So for years, I think like in the 1700s, there sort of a formal publishing started, but scientific publishing, I would say, started, mid 1800s, and it sort of started to get going, and it was a real service. And then finally, like in the 50s, they had peer review. Before, just the editors would review the papers submitted and either agree to publish them or not. And up until the 90s, it was a real service, I thought. It sort of was a model that kind of worked because we didn't have digital media. And so the publishing companies did a real service. They took in your journal, your article, and they compiled a journal, they printed it, they distributed it to libraries. All the universities who had access to the libraries, allowed everyone to use them. And it worked pretty well. But now with the onset of digital publishing, that overhead of printing is much lower. So it's much cheaper to produce and distribute this information. There still are costs involved with managing editors and the publishing platform and things like that. So what happened in the 90s then, there was a push to have more access to the papers, open access. So people who were not part of universities or in other countries that didn't have these sort of agreements could access the journals as well. And so they started open access. Some journals had a hybrid model where you could either, where the person submitting the article paid a fee, an APC, or article processing charge to get their article published. And so then it was open access. It was free to be viewed by anyone. If you didn't do that, your article was paywalled, and people who didn't have an agreement with their universities or whatever could not see the article. So we're at this stage now where there's problems with both. Publishing companies are making a large profit. And the question is, for instance, if you're like in a underrepresented country that doesn't have much money, it's really hard to publish open access. You just don't have the money to submit your paper. And obviously you can't access non-open access papers. So what do we do? Some people some groups are trying, nonprofits that are trying to keep their fees as low as possible. That's one solution. Some are just having very, very bare bones approaches in which they have articles on preprint servers. And that the idea there is that the preprint servers are not reviewed, but they're out there. And most people in the field kind of know who the authors are. And so they kind of pick and choose what articles are worth reading and citing. So that things might go in that direction. Recently, so just before I get into the discussion here, recently there was a lawsuit put out by a person in our OHBM community, Lucina Uden. And the lawsuit, and we can get into this in our discussion, but the lawsuit mostly was revolving around the idea that reviewers are not paid. And so if you're making a profit off of something, and reviewers and even editors are not paid, then that's not the best thing. And but there's more to the lawsuit. But that's I think as far as I understand it, that's the main issue. But we can talk about that more. So now to talk to all three of you, and any one of you could jump in. But obviously, I missed a lot of things in my summary of the field of scientific publishing. But what do you think is the main thing that needs to change most right now? What are all the problems? Or maybe you can tell what you think are the problems, and what do you think should most likely be addressed most immediately?
Well, I mean, I'll start. I don't really have a great answer to that. I'll put that out there first. I mean, the thing that I think things are getting better. I mean, there's no going back, as you prefaced, to the 90s with articles behind paywalls. There's absolutely no going back. There's no going back to being completely captured by for-profit publishing houses. Now we've got a diversity, a much more fluid and a much more diverse publishing landscape, and so that's a lot better. And I think the emergence of or the rise of non-profit publishing houses like MIT Press, eLife, the PLOS House are moving in the right direction. To me, what really needs to change, I mean, it's not moving chairs on the Titanic, it's making the Titanic too small. I mean, I have to say, there's just not enough funding in science at the moment. And so compromises have to be made. It's even in a rich Western country like Australia, it becomes very expensive per annum to publish everything open access. So really, we're all about non-profit, low APC. And so I would say what needs to happen next is funding agencies and federal governments need to step up and refund science. I mean, in Australia, science has been effectively defunded. We're looking at 60% cuts over 15 years in real terms. And that makes everything just so much more difficult. I think the other thing is that it sounds a bit harsh, but libraries which are institution-based come from institutions with a lot more money than labs. And if we've gone from pay to read, the old toll-based system to pay to publish, libraries have to fund labs to publish. I mean, we get publishing costs through the year, but we just published a paper. It was $5,000, which is an annual postdoc travel fund for my group. And the library just said that they'd run out of funds for the year. So out of nowhere, I have to chuck out the $5,000 to publish in the public domain. Now, I'm not complaining about putting the paper in the public domain. With misinformation and the recent elections around the world, it's clear we must put science straight into the public domain, absolutely. But libraries need to cough up all their university funders and pay labs to publish. I think that's the most important thing. And then labs have a diversity of opinion, possibilities now. I mean, I'm still heavily in favour of peer review. I think eLife has a nice model where you can do peer review and publish at any time, or you publish more traditionally after peer review. Archives play an important role, but I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think constructive peer review, even of our best work, provides that impartial opinion. So I'm a bit of a traditionalist, so we could keep publishing, things are more diverse, but we need money to sustain that from governments and libraries. So that's what I try and summarise to my answer in your question, Peter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of continue on that thread a little bit, Peter. So Dr. Breaky was talking about diversity in publishing, which I view as a really, really good thing. But what comes with diversity in publishing may also be that some publishing outlets might have more serious financial constraints than others. And one of the things that concerns me is sustainability and thinking ahead to when none of us on this call are going to walk this earth. There are some wonderful pieces of science from the era that we've been doing science and watching our colleagues produce some amazing work. I'd like that to be available to people, in 100 years from now, in the way that I appreciate work from 100 years ago. And so that's the thing that concerns me with a lot of these new efforts. I'm not sure if people are thinking through all of the financial gremlins that are lurking. And there are lots right now, more so than there used to be, perhaps. So I think we need to be thinking about the sustainability and the financial models that'll allow those publishing outlets to keep going. So that's my biggest concern. And I know there are many, many other concerns, but that's one that I think needs to be put on the table. And then the second thing that I'm really concerned about is veracity in science. And the thing that concerns me at the moment is the influx of AI-based literature searches and other kinds of tools that are designed to help the scientists. And in principle, I'm all for these, but I've seen some really worrying things in practice. And I have a collaborator in Finland who likes to test out the AI, and we've had some spectacular hallucinatory output, talking about publications of ours or publications of colleagues that simply do not exist.
Yeah.
And that's something that really, really concerns me. And then the other thing that also concerns me is that people are not checking these sources. And so, these things are potentially going into press, and there are these bogus sources of literature that potentially are ending up in our scientific corpus, and that don't exist. So that's one thing.
Yes.
The second thing related to veracity is plagiarism and self-plagiarism and image duplication and textual duplication and, the tortured phrase stuff and all of that. And that software to do plagiarism checks well is not cheap, but I think it's really, really worth investing in for any publication outlet. And so that's where I would really want people who want to go into the publishing game to really make sure that they can guarantee quality content that's accurate. So they're the two issues that they may be maybe sidelines to the main event because, costs, like Dr. Breaky mentioned, are obviously really important. But I think these are probably on the next tier down, but they worry me a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, Nico, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, scientific publishing is the best business ever, right? People sometimes come up with these analogies, and often these analogies fall much short of the reality, right? So we could imagine a restaurant business that's like scientific publishing, where the customer buys their own groceries, then goes home, cooks their own meal at home, puts it on the table, and then the restaurant comes by and puts a little garnish of parsley on top. And then it has all kinds of charges, like charges for the plates, even though the plates were bought and put on the table by the customer, and for a number of other things. And then they ask for payment for the meal in full, and then go home. And the person who made the meal is also the customer and is paying for the product that they produced, right? So, I mean, this will sound totally crazy, but let's just quickly remember for those listeners who aren't in science. So, scientists do the research, they do the writing, they do a lot of they do all of the reviewing for free of papers to evaluate the papers. They do a lot of the editors, as all three of you have done in your careers. All of this is paid for by taxpayers, and then there's a product, and that product is sold back to the same scientists, and taxpayers again pay for it. So, I mean, maybe this is a little unfair because it sounds as though publishers aren't doing anything. They are doing a little bit something. They make it pretty, so they work on having a nice layout for the journals. They provide access, so they have servers where you can access the scientific literature, and they administer the peer review process, and that's a very important evaluation process, of course, that ends up deciding whether a particular paper gets into a particular journal. And then the label of that journal provides something that's very important for the scientific community, which is an immediate indicator to how significant and how compelling that piece of research might be. And this is something that we can't do without, and we'd have to replace in some way. However, these contributions from the publishers, as you've outlined, Peter, have gotten much cheaper in the age of digital publication and the internet. Right? So the system was really set up in a different era before we had these technologies. So those costs have gone way down. And now the expensive costs are all the other costs that the scientists do, and all of that is paid for by taxpayers. So it is really a questionable business model. And of course, there's lots of brilliant people working in that industry, and they're not bad people individually, right? It's just a system that has this possibility to make a lot of money funded by taxpayers. And of course, they're going to do that, right? It's going to be very difficult to get them to stop doing that voluntarily or to be open to arguments for why this isn't fair or the like. I think that's totally misguided. It's misguided to vilify them, but it's also misguided to look to them for leadership in any way. It's totally the wrong approach. What we need to do is just rethink how we want to organize scientific publishing in the context of current technology. And the scientific publishing system has to provide two major functions. One is access, the other is evaluation. With preprint servers, we have an alternative system for access, and that is actually working very, very well. And it's not really an alternative. So all the papers, almost all of our papers are in preprint servers first, and then also in journals. But anyone who wants to read them can also read the preprint. It always has the final version. So de facto, this makes everything open access. Right? So preprint servers are an excellent way to subvert for-profit publishing in terms of this one very important function, the function of access, and that is already working, right? So you might ask, well, if you have this alternative access system, why can't you move beyond this for-profit publishing way of doing things? It's because the other function, evaluation, which the journals are administering and which science badly needs, because as Aina and Michael emphasized, peer review is critical and continues to be critical. And we have to find ways of organizing that independently as well. And all the diversity of this richer landscape that Michael talked about, these are very important sort of gradual developments that go in the right direction. And I would like to see them move a little bit more quickly and then go a little bit more fully toward a different system in which scientific research is published immediately as a preprint and available to all. And then the peer review process is conducted post publication so that it can be entirely open for anyone to contribute to peer review, open for anyone to scrutinize the peer reviews, because that's a very important part of the scientific record, and also open-ended in the sense that the evaluation of the paper can go on indefinitely because it's never set in stone. Science is never set in stone. It can always happen that mistakes are found later, or that papers that initially didn't appear to be groundbreaking or especially important are later found to be that important, right? And so
Yeah.
I think we have a chance here to really use modern technology to invent an entirely new system that makes good on an old vision for science, but in the open, in a totally connected way that keeps a record of all of that careful thinking that goes into the peer review process as well.
Yeah. No, I like your idea. Actually, it made me realize, and others can chime in on this, but I love the idea of, I mean, just even rethinking the idea of a journal. Like what a journal does is sort of, it takes the reviewers, it has a brand, and it sort of brands it with the reviewers, like, okay, this is a good paper. Um, that whole thing, you could imagine having, maybe 20 years in the future, whatever, having simply everything going to preprint servers, and then maybe having like OHBM, having a paper clearinghouse where members of OHBM chime in on what paper is better than the other, and it's all there. And then you can kind of go in. I sort of liken it to, I don't. It's not a perfect analogy, but something like Amazon or Reddit or something where you have respected people who are in science who sort of manage this clearinghouse of evaluations that and it could be, you don't really have to necessarily read all the reviews, but you can look at the ratings and who's rating it and then see it, and then each paper will have a tag with that, and you can imagine that's it. It's like if you have some respected body like OHBM doing just taking, scraping off all the brain related preprints and rating them and then having it right there. That's another option that would be cheap and easy, and you don't have this sort of further step where these publishers say, okay, these are our papers, and which seems somewhat unnecessary.
A couple of challenges related to what Nico said and Peter, what you said, which I'm not disagreeing with what either of you said, but I'm just throwing out a couple of questions for some things that might be problematic to deal with, and I don't have an answer with how to deal with them. First is the idea of preprints. I like the idea of people submitting preprints. But what bothers me right now is that, our preprints are being cited, and that's great. But then, what if that work is wrong? I mean, what's the mechanism for? Obviously, the preprint will be corrected and all of that. But those original citations might be incorrect. So that's one thing. then related to when the paper is indefinitely open, which again I think is a good idea, but what happens in an instance where there is a genuine error that's flagged in the paper, and of course every paper will have a unique digital object identifier. What happens then? Does that DOI stay the same? Is it modified? What happens, and how do you deal with things that are when there are corrections that are issued? And then there's also just the changing zeitgeist, because when we look at papers back from 25, 30 years ago, when I look back at some of the work that I had originally published, I think, oh, crumbs, things have really changed. But, it's out there and it stands and people can replicate it. But things have changed. The way we think about science has changed. And I don't think that's worth stressing about and changing. That was just science as it was back then.
Yeah.
So that's not something I'd want to change and rewrite the paper. So where do you stop tweaking is the question that I'm asking there, if it's open for indefinite change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could say a few words about that. I mean, I think inherently science is always an incremental process. And I think it should be up to the scientists and authors to decide when to do a revision of a paper and when to leave it as is and move on with their work. And then maybe there'll be later different papers with different titles that go beyond the work of a particular paper. And I think that the full history of the versions of a paper, of course, all online, and that's already a solved problem on archive, right? There's a series of versions, they're all separate, and the older versions are always still accessible, so you always know which version you've been citing. An important part, of course, is the evaluation part, right? And you touched upon this, that there might be a danger. Some people might see a danger in things being published without being evaluated. But there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because without papers being accessible to the community cannot evaluate that work, right? So the way it works now with the publishers administering peer review is it's a closed door secret process. And many of us are reviewers in that process. Most reviewers, in my experience, try to be objective and do a good job. But nevertheless, for a number of different reasons, this needs to be brought out into the open. For one thing, many of those brilliant reviews really contain a lot of good insights that will be of interest to a very small number of other scientists who are working on exactly the same questions and are really digging in. Second, for the peer review process to have that authority that we needed to have and that we needed to lend to science as a whole, it needs to be fully transparent and on the record. And then also we need to bring to it the brain power of as much of the community as possible. Of course, it's hard because reviewing is a lot of work. And we cannot just, it's easy to say, oh, well, what if 100 people wrote careful reviews about every paper? Of course, that's not possible. But about the most important, most impactful papers, there should be 100 reviews written, right? So I think before we elevate with, for example, prestige journals, and we should talk about what the alternative would be to publications like Nature and Science, maybe a little later in this conversation, before we elevate something to the attention of the entire world, I think there should be a period of perhaps a year where it's out in the open, anyone can read it, and it's being evaluated by the community, and it gathers 100 reviews, and then as a community we're really sure that what we're putting forward there is really reliable information. So this touches on other issues of the credibility of science and institutions and liberal democracies that I think a system like that can really contribute to. And I would, in that context, also address another concern. So if we think about rating and likes and the Amazon system of stars, I think there's a a reasonable fear that it might devolve into a popularity test or something that is not as thorough as peer review. I would hope for the peer review process to become more thorough and not less thorough in such an online system. So I think very careful written reviews should play a large role in this, and it should not just be about clicking thumbs up or like. I think thumbs up or like actually should not be used. I think maybe numerical ratings should be used, but they should come with error bars, and there should be a combination of signed and anonymous reviews and ratings. So there's reasons to have each of them. There needs to be the possibility, for example, for a early career researcher or PhD student to present a critical argument that might totally obliterate study from a famous lab. And that must be possible without that person fearing social consequences. On the other hand, I would hope for a lot of that evaluation to end up being signed and in the open, because I think of it ideally as the equivalent online to what we do at conferences, where someone gives a talk and then we get up and we say our opinion and we stand by our judgment. And the fact that we stand by our judgment and we make those statements out in the open is a very important constraint on the individual to be very, very careful, because you don't want to be making questionable arguments and then have that be on the record forever, right? And so the gravity of it being out there, I think, will provide the necessary restraint and care in the peer review process.
So Nico, just really quickly, I mean, I can imagine a little bit of pushback in that, in the sense, I like the idea, but it seems that I barely have time to read any papers, much less the review. I could imagine, like, oh my gosh, I have to read all the review, to be sort of on top of it. And
no one has to read the reviews, right?
Right. No, I know, but still, just sort of, I think that a combination of maybe like a tiered sort of like, different categories of ratings plus a review. I agree with that. I think, yeah, some people might push back a little bit that they would have to sort of at least digest the reviews a little bit to get a sense of the paper, as opposed to wanting some sort of essence of how the paper stands in some sense. But oh yeah, Michael.
Yeah, so much stuff to discuss. I feel like we should be sitting around. Yeah. I mean, we are sitting around a table, but I think Nico, I got to disagree a little bit with your analogy. I think now we see journals have to do plagiarism reports, AI checking. Having worked in edited thousands of papers, you do get legal issues that arise around when the plagiarism have occurred or co-authorship disputes. So sometimes you need recourse to a legal team or an ethical team. I think if you look at, I was just looking at network neuroscience, imaging neuroscience, and eLife. The cost is about $1,600 to $2,500 for eLife, $1,600 for imaging neuroscience. That's about the cost of a sustainable non-profit publication per paper model, I think, where all those things I've discussed, plus going back to Aina's point, financial sustainability. You want the publishing house or whatever it is to be around in 10, 15 years so the papers don't disappear. And that was one of the things where you've got to build some storm walls against a period of loss of publishing profit. But other than that, I think we're on the same page. I don't think there's a role for, except maybe exceptional circumstances that we can talk about at the end, for more expensive article publication costs. I'm all for open publication of the peer review process. From my point of view, and you touched on this, most reviewers, not just ECRs, but submit franker, sort of more factual reviews when they don't sign. I hate to say this, but even when a senior person signs, there's often this supercilious social aspect to it. Some of us can put that aside and be very frank in our reviews and still sign it. And most of the time I do that now. But often you just want to get the review, get the factual opinion. The person can still get credit for that through another system by registering that without de-anonymizing. Yeah, so I'm fully for open publishing the peer reviews. And even if you don't read them all, every now and then a paper captures your eye, and I find it interesting to read the reviews and read the exchange. And then, of course, I'm sure we'll all agree on this, publication of the code, because that makes sure the technical accuracy is reproducible. And we've all moved towards that in the last 5 years with GitHub and other enablers of code publication. Yeah, I think we do need to protect science against bad faith players, and that comes up when there's like COVID or when there's climate science. We need to look at all these checks and balances, and it makes me feel very conservative because so many wonderful people in science just want to publish their work, get critical appraisal, and you get these small number of bad faith persons coming often from outside of science, but we still need to have checks and balances so that we don't get false information published or badged. And once again, you hear, oh, well, bad science gets published even with peer review. And that's true. It's not perfect, but it is a check and balance. And it should just be a check and balance. It shouldn't be gateholders. And I guess that's part of the problem with eLife, that there is a bit of gateholding at these very senior editors. Yes, I've just thrown out some ideas, and they're not solutions. When we see something that is really creative like eLife, we once again see the shortfalls of that. But that's why I go back to the diversity of publishing. And in my group, which is a reasonably big group, not a huge group, we have our big impact papers that we hold back and put a lot of work in. You have other projects, people come through, they don't have 2 years for a paper or 3 years for a paper. So we do have work that we're looking at, publishing and communicating as people come through the group. And so I like the diversity because you can look at what papers you're coming out, what reports you're writing as a group, and pick and choose where you might communicate those.
I would also second the, I think that there is something like Michael said about anonymous reviewers. I even find myself, if I'm like in certain contexts forced to have a non-anonymous reviewer, I can't help but make a slightly different tone. Not that I'm sort of mean if I'm anonymous and not, but it's sort of like, I feel like, okay, am I going to have to defend this to a broader audience? It's not just the authors, and you sort of maybe couch things a little bit differently. That may not be a service to the paper as much, but I like giving people a choice as far as that's concerned.
Yeah. I would push back a little bit on that because I do sign my reviews and, sometimes I feel uncomfortable doing it. But I do that as a senior person, and I would really like to see senior people do that because there are, and Michael and Nico have mentioned that there are people who want to push their line of science and push it a bit too hard. And I think that stop sometimes people publishing alternate points of view. And that shouldn't happen. And I'd like to see the names of senior people on their reviews and for those reviews to be published and for everyone to be able to see them. That's what I'd like. And I'd like to protect early career researchers from retribution because they don't have a chance to defend themselves, in their early career. So I take a little bit of a hard line. I'm actually going to be reviewing a paper for a really big journal over the next couple of weeks. So it'll be interesting to see what I end up writing. But with respect to that, I think one thing that I try to do when I write a review, when I sign it, it's about being respectful to the authors. There's nothing wrong with disagreeing with them and saying, look, maybe you should think about doing it this way because da 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 da. What I don't like, and I've seen some really nasty reviews by senior people when they're anonymised, and there's an effective tone that doesn't do any service to the review, and it shouldn't be there. And so if we can get rid of that and deal with the facts, but the facts can be presented in a really great way. I mean, when you have a graduate student who's writing a manuscript, you're going to point out what's wrong with the manuscript, but you're also going to think about that person's feelings. I don't think that should be any different when you're writing reviews for a journal. It's
Yeah.
about respect. It's respect for your colleagues in this instance.
Yes.
Why should that be any different?
I completely agree, Aina, and I think my point comes with two caveats. One is that we probably need to teach more about how to review, and always review in a constructive tone, whether you sign it or not. Carl Friston once told me when I was quite junior, always make sure no matter what you suggest, and I don't make strong suggestions to the editor, that editors can make the decision, always make a review so that the authors can make the paper, improve the paper. No matter what your opinion is, always give a constructive review, and always consider, as you've said, that the first author might be their first paper. And so always consider that, whether or not you sign it. And if you need to sign it to be polite, or fair enough, but I don't think you should need to put your name to be a polite reviewer. The other thing is the role of the editors. Editors, and we had at NeuroImage, which I know is carried on to Imaging Neuroscience, a very strong collegial editorial team. And you don't get away with being a nasty senior reviewer when your colleagues are editing the papers. And this is a great thing about a community journal like Imaging Neuroscience, that, you're kind of not anonymous. You might be anonymous to the authors, but you're not anonymous to your peers who are the editors. And it's kind of nasty. And as an editor, I'd often occasionally go back to the reviewer and either ask them to tone down, or even remove some of the unnecessary inflammatory remarks. Or if it was a complete ad hominem review, I would just ignore it completely. So that's the importance of editing, and that's the importance of us probably doing better jobs of mentoring around reviewing. But I always do write a review considering that the first author might be one of my own PhD students or postdocs, but we don't do enough teaching as senior people about the importance of the tone of reviews. And you can be as not critical, but as clear as possible in your concerns about factual contents of the paper or technical aspects of the paper. But there's no room ever for not considering the person who has written the paper.
I agree with a lot of that. And I would argue that transparency for all peer reviews, publishing the peer reviews, it goes some way toward addressing the point a little bit, because those aggressive reviews, when they're published, also are less compelling to people, and they'll be viewed critically when the record is examined later on, right? So I think there is a strong argument based on these observations for transparency and publishing all the reviews. And then whether reviews should be signed or not, I think there's a strong case that we need both options. And I would love to see us develop, more maturity to be able to be critical in a constructive way without being afraid to disagree, even passionately. So there should be no distortion of our judgment at all in order to be pleasant or to be nice, but we want to be as constructive as possible in the way that we phrase it. We want to make the process better. That's the overall goal, right? And if as many of us can sign as possible, and if there were sort of maybe kind of a soft social norm, or if you sign, you add a little more gravity to your review, right? If you don't sign, there is a question about why you can't stand by your judgment, and I think that's about right. If that choice is given to every reviewer, and many people do end up signing, then we'll have a better
Yeah.
system.
It actually occurred to me that there should be classes. We do this enough, and it's all sort of learned by a process. There should be classes on reviewing papers, and I think that would take away the fear, like in young reviewers, of stating the review, because they're always worried. I think that especially junior scientists are worried about senior scientists sort of sabotaging their career if they say something bad about their paper or something. And so I think to allay that fear, and just simply to make more standard and better reviews, there should be classes, maybe at OHB.
Absolutely. Having reviews accessible, of course, is also a great way to teach people, right? So young researchers may never have seen a review or only a few reviews for, until they submit a paper, right? Imagine all those reviews were available online, then every PhD student has seen many reviews long before they submit their first paper.
It's true.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we could think about is I often will review a paper with a graduate student and, they get to do the review first and we do it together. And that's a good way for people to do that. But the other thing to think about, maybe for some things like OHBM, for instance, maybe we should have sessions on like a reviewer clinic or something along those lines. And that's something that I don't think we've ever done. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember ever having anything like that. And maybe that's something we should be doing.
Yeah. I think it would help our own science as far as that's concerned.
And how to edit, really, too, because people moving through their career will be in editorial positions, whether they're even guest editing or becoming an action editor. I will say one thing I've learned over many, many years is from someone coming from my position, and I understand there's privilege and all of those components, but be nice. I mean, I often think I'm not smart enough to be nasty. So many times in my career have I felt an urge to say something, sometimes to editors who ignored my lovely review and made a decision. And or sometimes to someone giving a talk where I was going to put up my hand and say, "Oh, you haven't done cross-validation or something." And I can't tell you how many times, it could be months, it could be years later, that we're all colleagues and our paths interact like a big bowl of spaghetti, and you come back and you have these interactions with people in the future, and sometimes they can be critical for your own career. And sometimes it might be that being really thorough with review but constructive will impress a senior editor, and they might even end up wanting to work with you. So we probably need to, even in self-interested mode, always be polite, constructive, because you don't know where the privilege and the tables will turn, and your whole career or major grant might depend on something, or someone might invite you to give a talk. Yeah, so that goes beyond peer review and editing, but it's a very important principle, I think, as a scientist.
Yeah, I
And
completely.
you may even get offered a job as well.
Yes.
I speak from experience. So
That's
So let me.
that's important, but of course, be nice within the constraint of honesty, right? So you want to be honest, and you want to make sure that all your critical thoughts are reflected in your review, right? At least all the
Absolutely,
important ones.
yeah.
Right? So maybe you have some critical thoughts that end up being trifles, or that are things that you judge to be more to do with your particular perspective, and you could consider whether they're really important enough to mention. But I do worry also. I mean, it depends who you give this advice to, Michael, right? So there are people who are not nice enough, but there are also people who are too nice and who have a hard time really thinking critically, even when there is a social pressure to be pleasant, and when they're afraid to be judged for being overly critical, right? So this is really like
Absolutely,
a
yeah.
difficult struggle. What I do personally is I first try to not be nice at all, just write bullet points of like all my thoughts unfiltered, and then I try to make sure that I put it constructively.
Yeah.
But I think there is a difficult tension there, that there is no simple solution, right? Because sometimes you have to say things that the authors are not going to love to hear,
Yeah.
And you would
Yeah,
hope that
100% agree. Being nice doesn't mean not being constructive and being fair. I mean, you've got to remember if you're being nice in the soft sense to people who you're reviewing, there's another group of authors who are encountering another review process, and implicitly you're not being fair to them if you're not being objective with the material in front. So I do mean be completely objective, be critical, be constructive might be a better word for it than being nice. Don't temper the constructive, critical aspect of what you've got to your evaluation through a normative pressure to be nice. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I don't like the word nice either. I prefer respectful and mindful, and that mindfulness and respectfulness extends out into the professional sphere anyway. You're going to be in meetings where you have to talk to colleagues in about problems, and you have to be able to articulate your point. And you mightn't agree with them, and you have to articulate that. And that's actually a harder position to take. I would say that if you're writing a review for the paper, like Nico says, your first pass at doing the review is always going to be a bit rough around the edges, and then you temper it, and you make it professional, so that someone can read it and understand the what you're being critical about, and what they need to how they need to actually make constructive changes to their manuscript to improve it. I'd say that writing reviews in that sense is easier than having to stand up at a meeting and then off the top of your head have to deal with a really difficult situation that you haven't had a chance to think about. That's harder, but
Yeah.
it happens in the work sphere too, and people need to navigate that too. So I think we can do it, and I think we can do it with a bit of thought, provided we don't leave doing the review till the 11th and three-quarters hour before it's due.
Yeah. Well, that's always. So let me ask. Okay, so along these lines. Okay, so I think we've all come to agreement that it's probably a good discipline to try to be not anonymous and to try to be as fair and critical and balance that respectfulness and criticality as much as possible. But so now back to maybe this ties in pretty well with Lucina's lawsuit. I mean, her main thing is, and I was actually surprised. I was at this meeting and this topic was brought up. How many people felt strongly that that reviewers should be paid, that should be the incentive? And I'm thinking, wow, I don't think that's gonna. I don't think that one, what that's an added cost, and two, I feel that's putting the incentives in the wrong place. My feeling is so. I'm somewhat feeling like I don't think it's a good idea. What do you think as far as paying reviewers?
I think that early career researchers are struggling financially often. And so if anybody's going to be remunerated, it should be them. And it's not those of us, irrespective of whether we've got a mortgage or not.
Yeah.
The senior folks should not have to derive income from that. But I think having just a bit of a bonus for those early career folks to help
Okay.
them out a bit would be really good.
Okay. Okay. No, I think or maybe have them paid if they're not anonymous. I mean, if they sign it, they're paid, or. But I like the idea of a junior, sort of bias towards that in some sense. But I don't know. I actually don't. I haven't thought about this. I always thought it was something I did as an academic. It's part of what my salary was for. But I don't know.
I think we should cut the cost of the system to a fraction of what it now is, but then stay with peer reviews being something that scientists just do. But I think in terms of activism, there might be an argument for questioning scientists doing reviews for for-profit publishers for free, right? But
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is maybe a little bit of a double-edged sword, because if we want to move in a direction where we have not-for-profit publishers dominate the scene at least, and we want free peer review, then maybe this would be a detour or a diversion from that.
I feel like after Aina's point, I can't sit here and say, no, we're not going to pay our EMCRs. I think EMCRs, like all of us, should get a proper livable salary, and we have a reasonable salary conditions in Australia, better than some other conditions. But on the whole, if we're looking at non-profit publishing, who's going to be paying the cost of the reviewers will be the authors. And then this is another strange incentive. But let me just preface this by saying I fully applaud Lucina's law case.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really going to put the for-profit publishers on notice that this is
Yep.
an unfair scenario where people are publishing, working for free for a profitable publish house. However, as we move to non-profit publishing, then we're looking at authors paying for a reviewer to publish. And I think probably Lucina would agree. You pay if you're given a proper salary to go to work, which we should fight to make sure we all get, even as a PhD student, and you're peer reviewing for a non-profit house. You're doing that service, hopefully, for the community in a way that the authors of that paper will replicate or reciprocate when you submit your paper for peer review. That's the nice collegial dream for us all, that we get paid to go to work, and part of that is peer reviewing each other's papers, and not in a forum where we're not having our work siphoned into massive profits.
Yeah.
So all courage and hope for that court case, but I agree with Nico. The incentive should be away from for-profit publishing. I think there are there are scenarios where purely professional editors play an important role. And I say that as someone who's been a science editor of Peter and I and Aina. We've edited thousands and thousands of papers, probably tens of thousands of papers. And this is the great engine house of imaging neuroscience, and the other science edited journals. But I've had good experiences with purely professional editors, and maybe they're a little bit less skin in the game, because they're not struggling for their survival as publishing and reviewing. So yeah, I'm not. I think there's a role for paid editors. Put it this way: whatever publishing house they work for, they, in my experience, have a great role to play, from going to meetings, meeting with scientists, seeing from their own perspective, looking across fields. Like they might go to molecular biology meeting, they might go to human brain mapping, they might go to Society for Neuroscience. They bring that greater perspective and that sort of more. I mean, editing is a profession, so professional editors play a role. We learn how to edit in the world of science through being hopefully mentored. I mean, I was what did we used to call them back in Neuroimage? Editor, sub-editor, handling editor. And
Right,
then
handling editor.
Yeah, Peter, you were the senior editor, and then I became the senior editor, and we had many other interactions. Aina was the senior editor. We had, of course, the wonderful Keith Walsley, who was the methods editor. Yeah, we have that role, but I do think there's a role for professional editors in the field of science.
Yeah, I agree. Editing is a different level of commitment and time that probably should be compensated to a little bit more than what it has been. Reviewers, I think I like the idea of for profits should pay reviewers. That makes sense. But the low overhead sort of nonprofit, maybe that's a different story. Yeah, it's interesting. So the other parts of this lawsuit, so this non-compete clause in terms of, if you submit a manuscript to one journal, you can't submit it to another simultaneously. I'm not sure how significant that is, but the third one, the people who publish the article in these for-profit journals sort of sign away their rights. Technically, they can't redistribute their own article for free. Obviously, that's not really followed. I mean, I think that if anyone asks me for an article, I'll just send it to them. But and so those are the three aspects of this lawsuit that, yeah, it's at least important to look at it. And at least this, I'm very interested to see how this plays out, because I think it will start to shake some of the foundations of this system that that needs changing as far as that's concerned. I don't know if anyone of you want to chime in on any of those other points, but
it highlights the point that I made in the beginning, that no matter how farcical a story you come up with, you never do it justice, right? I tried to do it with the restaurant analogy,
yeah,
but I forgot to say that you, after you buy the groceries, cook the dish, and put it on the table, you give it for free to the publisher. You sign over your copyright for the recipe that you created, and then the publisher sells it back to you immediately. It is amazing, right? And the journals, each journal is a monopoly because there's unique content there, and the universities, the academic institutions need for that content to be accessible. And so they have no alternative. They're sort of locked into paying subscription fees, which have been rising very quickly in the past decades. And it's amazing. It's
yeah.
really unbelievable.
Well, it is kind of like, I mean, it seems like the big publishers, there's somewhat, I mean, I think there's a hint here in the lawsuit that it's sort of like an oligopoly, is that the right word? In which the publishers are kind of all working with an agreement to do it this way. And I'm not sure, yeah, how that could be broken other than, so then that's a question. So clearly there's potentially better models, and maybe it's happening naturally and organically, like, there's more open access journals that are low cost, that are nonprofits, that people are gravitating towards. There's a grassroots sort of thing where people are incentivized just by the community to do that sort of thing. But at the same time, there might be more top down, like was mentioned. Funding agencies are putting rules on how much they're going to be paying for the APCs, and maybe there has to be more strict guidelines on that.
I think there's also a role that editorial boards can play, and I think we've had a few instances of editorial boards where the whole group of people just pick up and walk away.
Yeah,
And we had that as a spectacular example in our own field fairly recently, and that picking up and walking away was supported by the community at large. And neuroimaging isn't the only community where that's happened. And I think that made some of the publishers, sit up and take notice. Now, obviously, not much has happened, but I think that's going to become more and more common in the future. They walk away and then they strike up a deal with another publishing outlet that actually addresses their concerns. I think there'll be more of that in the future.
yeah, no, that's actually right. I mean, with imaging neuroscience now, and that was spectacular. I know that when Michael and I were editor in chiefs, that was even brought up from time to time.
Yes, we did talk about that in the past.
Yeah,
We did.
and
Yeah, we had
finally,
extensive discussions, and the writing was on the wall. And
Right.
we flipped to open access. The problem with that model was the divide and conquer, that you no longer even had the collective bargaining of the libraries. You had individual labs struggling to pay to publish, and that was unsustainable. And it's great how that, I think the field had changed with all the activism of early and mid-career researchers to really get behind the editorial board in a way that maybe wouldn't have happened 5 to 10 years earlier. And it wasn't
yeah,
without some divided opinion and controversy, but it's definitely, now imaging neuroscience is a wonderful forum to be publishing in, and we've got a couple of papers in the mill there now.
yeah.
So Michael, Peter, can you talk a little bit more about when you had those earlier discussions, why you didn't feel like you could move ahead? What was missing? Was the risk too large? Was there a dearth of alternative platforms? Because I think this is very important, right? So if the platforms existed, for example, publicly funded publishing platforms that are much more cost efficient and that ideally would provide better services, better functionality for administering peer review and also for access, then I imagine that would happen much more, right? So I'm interested in your experience. Like, what were those discussions, and what was holding it back, and then making it eventually happen?
Well, I'll let Michael speak to this too, but I think that at least when I was editor in chief, it was just beginning this idea of open access, and so we thought that we were trying to suggest the idea of open access, and I think at the time the journal was hesitant, and we thought, and there weren't as many alternatives. It was sort of, it felt like I don't think that it was as easy to jump to a nonprofit platform back then. Even back in 2015, it was, or 17 or whatever, it was less. That was less of a clear option, and also there was also this hope that we could negotiate with the publishers, and that's actually certainly what Steve tried, and that fell through. And so that was and they actually finally did. I think when Michael was in charge, they finally gave in and said, okay, let's have a hybrid model. And that seemed like a reasonable compromise at the time. Except
Yeah,
then
no, we probably, thanks, Peter, for highlighting that it was really a point of time in my editor-in-chief where it should have probably or could have switched.
Things were kind of quiet when I was editor-in-chief.
We would have had two email threads with 200 or 300 emails during this period of time. And I think a whole lot of things came to the head. Don't forget, Neuroimage receives 3,000 papers a year and publishes 1,000. That's a goods train that's constantly going through your train station. And, there are a lot of experimental platforms like Aperture that Peter and I got behind. No way could we suddenly put that goods train on this line and have people running in front of it who didn't even quite know what the publication model would look like yet. That would have been a disaster to the field. Interesting, MIT Press didn't have a big journal of that nature. Obviously, they've come to the party and they've now handling a large volume of papers. So what happened under my time was a lot of discussions. I couldn't, we're a collaborative team, so there's no top down. Everything was through consensus, and there were divided opinions at times, but we always settled on one course of action. What happened during that 5 years, or however long I was editor-in-chief, the discussions got stronger and stronger. The alternatives got better and better, particularly MIT Press and eLife. And frankly, the one argument was the quality of the service that the publication house provided. This is, as you've outlined, the platform for handling peer review, editorial opinion, plagiarism support, and most particularly post-publication copy editing to make it look pretty, which is actually pretty important, typesetting, hopefully some error detection. This just got worse and worse. It was embarrassing. We get papers, and Neuroimage is a mathematical, often a methods journal, where the equations were, the quality of the preprint was degraded. And it just got beyond the pale. And we flipped to purely open access. And at first, the publication cost was okay. But of course, once we were on board, what do you call it with Uber? When everyone wants to get to the everybody wants to get to the concert, and then they fare hike. So we're kind of captive.
Yeah.
Everything conspired. It was completely unsustainable, where you've got poor publication, copy editing, you've got papers that have been lost in the system for months, and that always irritated the editors, because this is another thing that you want. You want your junior authors to have a proper, thorough, and efficient editorial process. You find a paper that's hidden in this massive journal for 3 months. No one's emailed us about it. Yeah, it just, by the time I finished, the writing was on the wall, and it was really, it was very clear, I think, that Steve was going to take the community across to another journal. I personally worried about people who published in Neuroimage. If we went to MIT Press, did I have the authority of saying your publications in Neuroimage could be degraded in the lens of history? because it's now not the field leading journal. And I think it's fair to say Neuroimage is definitely not the field leading journal. Imaging Neuroscience and the other legacy journals are, or the legacy journals are. Yeah, just a lot goes through your head when you're editor-in-chief. Do you have the authority to say the work that's been published in Neuroimage could be devalued because the journal effectively will be left? And I think all the other decisions made it very clear that what the editors have done is definitely the right thing. The balance of all these pros and cons is definitely in favour of going to a non-profit open access model. And somewhere in the 5 years after I took over from Peter to when Steve stepped in, the equation changed dramatically. And I think the last months when I was there, it was clear that this was going to happen, and it needed to have someone, I think, new, refreshing to the editorial team to come through and do it. And so hats off to Steve for doing it.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say to Nico is that there was a lot of discussion over those years, and I was at Neuroimage with both Peter and Michael were editors in chief, and they did a stellar job, and they always consulted with everybody, the senior editors and all of that. There was a tremendous amount of discussion about what is the best thing to do for the field.
Yeah.
Do we stay or do we go? And let's just make sure we don't harm the field. If we have to suck it up for a while, let's do that. But we don't want to harm early career researchers. We don't want to harm the people who have published in Neuroimage. The other thing that happened was that the previous editors-in-chief of Neuroimage were also consulted about this whole scenario. So there was a lot of discussion, and decisions weren't made lightly. And when Steve decided to pull the plug with his editorial folks, they didn't take that decision lightly either. It was inevitable. We all knew it was eventually going to come, I suppose. And as Peter and Michael said, there was nothing available at the times when they were editors-in-chief, because I think one of the Elsevier people once described Neuroimage as being an oil tanker. You can't stop it on a dime. And so there was nothing out there that could handle, the manuscript handling and all of the management systems in the editorial system. There was nothing out there that could handle the sheer volume of manuscripts. So that's what really happened. I'm just really glad that the change has been made and it's working out now.
Yeah, the discussion actually, to be honest, we didn't even have that discussion. I mean, we didn't have an open access, so it was just simply still the old model. I think that, so it's interesting because I've talked to a number of people after this happened. I think by and large, everyone's happy that it happened, including myself. And some people actually disagree. There's one person in Switzerland who said, "Oh, well, these APCs are paid anyway by the government, and it's working out, and everything's fine." And now we can't. Now it's like they almost were restricted from submitting to Imaging Neuroscience, and they almost had. I don't know exactly what the rules were, but there's something in Europe where they were being supported to submit to open access journals like Elsevier. More than
Imaging Neuroscience doesn't have an impact factor yet. It takes a while for a journal to get on PubMed and all those underlying processes. So for the first months, you need senior people publishing there who don't need, the reputation of a legacy journal. That's another issue, and so the editorial team have done a remarkable job, because I think the impact factor must be due. We all know how flawed that is, but it's more being on PubMed and being a journal with a reputation for excellent science, and that's not a that takes some serious editorial and commitment for the community, and I think we're going to see that paying dividends.
Yeah. So what about, okay, so, all right, not to change the subject completely, but there's also, a lot of discussion as to the type of publication. Like PDFs feel like I like PDFs. I that feels like all I need. But some people, there's a preprint server called Neurolibre that has embedded code, and people publish data sets, people publish videos. So how would that be? What's the future of that? I mean, how do you review? How really do you review code? For instance, there's different levels of reviewing code. It's these are all problems that I think we're still working through in that regard, especially at Aperture Neuro, tiny journal with OHBM. But
Yeah, we have this
yeah.
educational day at OHBM on computational neuroimaging, and the organisers of that, particularly John Griffiths and David Monty, have done a wonderful job of putting together a comprehensive Jupyter notebook, and then you can execute the figures, and they'll, through the magic of a Jupyter notebook, produce the figures online. And this is an excellent educational tool. And I think I've definitely encouraged them to approach you at Aperture and publish it formally.
Yep.
That's not going to be every paper, but it's a wonderful example of a tutorial paper, I think. And it probably requires that people who read it or engage in it might go to the OHBM educational course and have the video in the background so that they can follow this. And this is a wonderful example of engaging didactically in science. But that's not going to be every single form of communication, and I don't think anyone suggested it is, but we should definitely accommodate that and platform it and embrace and amplify it as a great example of a publication output.
I think that science now, we have to be careful how we do this because science is team science now. Data sets are huge, and we have to think about how we can store the data and be able to access it easily. And so we need to think about the format that we can, present it in. And so having data available in manuscripts is a great idea, and we just have to be careful how we package it. That's all that I'm kind of thinking about, because as we move to portable devices, cell phones, we're doing science on that. I mean, that's how we're recording data now in our lab. We've gone out into the big bad world, and so that's going to keep going. And but the data sets won't get any smaller.
So let me. So Michael has to head off in about 5 minutes, but I think we can continue the discussion. But let me ask Michael one question I want to ask, of everyone. Just maybe this is the last question of Michael. Is where do you see, what's the end game here? Where do you see things in 20 years? Let's say, what can you imagine the publication world being like? I mean, I think that it's interesting because AI is growing. I would like to see, for instance, like with you go to neuroscience meeting, there's all these abstracts. The information is on the abstracts and then it's in each of our heads. It seems like if we could start to build a model of where the gaps are in our understanding of the brain. I mean, that's sort of a meta publication in some sense. That could hold the understanding in some sense. That's my thought. But Michael, and that's sort of a beginning of a thought. But yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Oh, I'm terrible at future forecasting.
Well, where would you want it to go?
Look, I'd like it to, amplify all of the good things that have happened in the last 5 years, where we don't lose the quality of the publication, we don't lose the quality or even improve the rigorousness of the constructive peer review. That goes on online or into the public domain, whatever that's going to look like in 20 years. There's checks and balances. I think you've raised the point of AI, particularly generative AI for text, and how to incorporate that. I think it's going to be impossible to hold it back, but people need to also, I think, declare their use of generative AI in whatever they're putting forward. And that's what we're doing now with our honours students. We don't pretend they don't use ChatGPT, but we are very strict in them declaring how they've used it and ensuring they don't and checking the text. Yeah, I'd like to see a world in which, you can publish, your big papers and they have a big impact on the field. We published this geometric eigenmodes 2 years ago. And it was just great to come to RHBM and James Pang and Alex Finito and the gang. And people were really interested in what it was, this sort of elephant in the glass shop. And it was wonderful from being around to see the sort of excitement that a big paper like that excited, and there was a lot of post-publication exchanges, and some of that went up onto archive and still ongoing. Yeah, and then your smaller papers are published and have a legacy and have a life, and that's wonderful, particularly for the students. Yeah, I definitely want to see a life in which you don't have to pay, you don't have to compromise your postdoc travel money, or actually your senior researcher travel money. We've got a climate travel policy in our group, and I've traveled the most in the past, so obviously I should travel the least in the future. Yeah, so we're publishing without these huge financial imposts or barriers. Yeah, so just more and more of the good stuff, executable papers, particularly for tutorials, more ambitious opinion and perspective pieces. I personally don't, apart from the issues that we've raised, particularly the financial imposts, I don't think the publishing landscape is terribly broken. I mean, we're continuing to do wonderful science. We're continuing to make a change to public policy, whether it's climate change, whether it's COVID, whatever it is. The world is continuing to be a much better place than it was 20 years ago. I hope. In some aspects, there's other fights that might be beyond the reach of science. So I do feel reasonably optimistic about what we're doing and what we're going. I definitely feel we know a lot more about the brain and how it works and how it doesn't work, and getting a lot more excitement about networks and dynamics and context, and all these beautiful maps that we're seeing. So yeah, I don't see 20 years, but I see maybe 5 to 10 years of hopefully amplifying all of the good stuff, and professional editors playing a specific role going forward, but large for-profit legacy journals playing less of a role. I think that's inevitable. I don't know how they're going to respond, but that's not our problem.
So I would say, aspects of the current system, in my mind, are broken. I mean, I think it's really weird that I click on a link to a paper and I hit a paywall, and I know my rich institution, Columbia University, allows me access. They're paying for it, but it's so difficult to get through to the paper that I might prefer to use Sci-Hub, which gives illegal access to the paper to anyone. And that's just a superior technology, right? And I think that is a broken state of affairs. Science is publicly funded and it should be openly accessible. And the publishers make an incredible amount of money. And nevertheless, they've never solved even the access problem. And the evaluation is far from optimal. I mean, they're doing things and it's working, and peer review is essential. The careful thinking about the papers that we do is essential, but they're also holding us back in a lot of ways. They're keeping us sort of locked in the secretive peer review process, where we've gotten to a point where we don't feel we're mature enough to just honestly tell each other what we think might be wrong with each other's studies and help each other improve our work. And that's just a little bit weird. So I think the first wave was open access and preprint servers, and that was sort of amazing. And some people thought that was going to be the revolution by itself, but access is only half the story. The other half is evaluation, of course. And now we're in this kind of middle phase, in my mind, where we're experimenting with a lot of alternative nonprofit journals that operate quite traditionally in many ways. So with editors and reviewers, and often some closed peer review process, but also new ideas like in eLife, where there's this peer reviewer conference. There's a little bit more interaction, and eLife is also going in a new direction by evaluating the papers more in detail. They have these significance evaluations, so how important the paper is and how strong the evidence is in favor of its claims. And I think that's actually an extremely important development, because that can take us beyond binary journal labels as indications of the quality of papers. And I think that's something that we will definitely need. And so where I see this going is toward a future where we have publicly funded publishing platforms that ensure diamond open access, so free for authors, free for readers, and the authors retain the copyright. And there'll be efficient, technologically more advanced ways of administering an open evaluation process. And there'll be sort of some freedom with respect to the level of editing, right? Whether you want to be something like a journal where there's a group of editors that sort of curates a particular stream of papers, or whether it's sort of broader and out of the open, and maybe there's a form of peer-to-peer editing. There are ideas like that that I find interesting, which would move the system entirely beyond journals. And I think no one can sort of tell what the right solution is, and probably one size doesn't fit all, and we need a lot of experimentation. But I would like to see funders think creatively about this. I would like to see also scientists think more creatively about how these processes should be organized. I think it's sort of an aspect of scientific methodology. When we do our science, we think about methodology a lot. About, for example, in the context of the paper that Michael talked about, there's a lot of very careful thinking about how to analyze these data, right? But somehow we don't really feel responsible for thinking about how we organize our publication system, or we feel responsible, but at a sort of in a smaller box where we're accepting a particular paradigm that I think eventually will not be the final paradigm. And we're not sort of taking this on as a creative challenge and looking to think about from first principles how this should be organized. And I think that will slowly happen in the next decade.
Well, from my point of view, I'd like to see science publishing negative results as well as positive results, and I'd like to see publishing models link with funders, so that when you get a grant funded, that you have a arrangement with some publisher to publish your findings that have been funded by taxpayers' money, whether those results are positive or not. And I think that the negative file draw problem has got to go away, because we can't be wasting money having people repeating studies and getting negative results. And so this has got to be out there. So I would really like to see that for both positive and negative results of grants that are funded with taxpayer money to be published out there. And there are some journals that are already doing pre-registered studies. So I think part of any grant that's funded, there should be pretty much automatic pre-registration, and that may be linked to perhaps the funders. And so I want to take some of the effort away from the scientists, because pre-registering studies is a lot of work. And if they've already written a grant telling people about what they've done, they shouldn't have to double up on that effort. Yeah. So there's got to be some imaginative way of doing that. That's what I would really like to see. And I'd like to see some of these controversial studies challenged, and particularly, studies that affect really health and disease. And, if there are controversial studies, they need to be replicated. And if they can't be replicated, then some of these people should be silenced once and for all, because they've done a lot of harm to people who have diseases. And I think we need to stop that dead in its tracks. Yeah. So they're the things that I'd like to see publishing sort of going down those tracks in 20 years' time, I think we can make our science much, much more value-added than it already is.
Well, I think on that note, now obviously there's so much more to talk to about. And maybe we could have another podcast on really the growing role of AI, which I think we've touched upon a little bit, but I think it's even going to get better. And how are we going to address that? But anyway, this was great. I really do appreciate all of you coming on, taking the time, sharing your opinions, and of course, this is an ongoing discussion, which I hope we'll keep on having with the community, and things will keep on evolving. So,
yeah, thanks very much for putting this together and your commitment to neuroscience, Peter.
oh well, thank you. This is a lot of fun, and all of you make it all the more fun.
Michael and Aina, it was a great conversation, and great to hear that backstory about neuroimage and imaging neuroscience.
We could write a short novel on it, I can tell you.
Oh yeah, we should.
Good.
We should. All right. Well, thanks again. All right. See you later.
Neurosalience is brought to you by Organization for Human Brain Mapping. This week's episode is produced by Xuqian Michelle Li and Omer Faruk Gulban.